For 2,000 years, men set fire to lead in the hope of making gold. They failed. And yet what they were really doing, without knowing it, was something stranger, and far more dangerous. They were performing surgery on their own souls. This is the story of alchemy. Not the cartoon of bearded charlatans muttering over bubbling cauldrons, but the secret psychology buried inside it. The one Carl Jung spent the last 30 years of his life digging out of the dunghill of history. What he found there was not a failed science. It was a map of the human mind, written in a code so dense, so deliberately obscure, that even its authors barely understood what they had drawn. To understand why this matters, we have to begin with a problem. The modern mind is brilliant at solving things outside itself. We measure stars, split atoms, sequence genomes, and yet most of us, walking around in this remarkable inheritance of reason, feel a quiet hollowness we cannot quite name. Something is missing, and we do not know what. Jung had a diagnosis. He believed that in our rush toward rationality, we had severed ourselves from the older half of who we are, the unconscious, the instinctual, the symbolic. The cost of building the Cathedral of Reason had been the slow demolition of the Temple of Soul. The dream, he wrote, is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul, opening into that cosmic night which was psyche long before there was any ego consciousness, and which will remain psyche no matter how far our ego consciousness extends. This is not a call to abandon reason. It is a call to acknowledge its one-sidedness. We have built a civilization that looks only outward, and we have populated it with people who feel, increasingly, that they are strangers in their own homes. Jung believed that the cure lay in reopening the door, in restoring dialogue between the conscious mind and what lies beneath it. He spent years searching for a tradition that had already done this work, a language of symbols he could use to translate the dreams and visions of his patients. He found it, eventually, in the place no one was looking. He found it in alchemy. When Jung first turned his attention to the ancient alchemical texts in his mid-50s, he hesitated. The material was vast, the symbolism dense, the language deliberately confused. Most serious scholars had dismissed alchemy as the embarrassing prehistory of chemistry, a failed attempt at science weighed down by mystical baggage. Newton had practiced it in secret, producing nearly 1 million words on the subject, but after his death, the manuscripts had been hidden away for fear of ruining his reputation. Even the name had been amputated. The al in alchemy comes from the Arabic, and behind it stands the Egyptian word kemet. The black lands along the Nile, the fertile soil from which the art took its name. To turn chemistry from alchemy, all you had to do was strip away the sacred. Chemistry, Jung saw, is the desacralization of alchemy, and alchemy is the shadow of modern science. The thing we threw away when we built our laboratories was not superstition. It was meaning. What the alchemists were really after, beneath the talk of furnaces and metals, was something Jung had been groping toward for decades in his own work. He had developed his theory of the collective unconscious, the archetypes, the slow, painful process of individuation by which a person becomes who they actually are. And when he read the alchemical texts, he recognized the images, the dragons, the kings and queens, the marriage of sun and moon, the death and resurrection of the philosophical child. These were not metaphors invented by clever writers. These were the same figures that appeared spontaneously in the dreams of his patients, people who had never read a word of alchemy in their lives. The alchemists, Jung concluded, had not been failed chemists. They had been the first depth psychologists, and they had not known it. To see what they were really doing, you have to understand a strange and beautiful idea. The alchemists believed that we are born whole and lose that wholeness as we grow. The infant has no ego, no separation between self and world. It is a circle, complete, undivided, Then, slowly, the sense of I begins to crystallize. And with it comes everything we associate with being a person language: will, self-consciousness, the long, quiet argument with reality. The price of becoming somebody is leaving behind the wholeness with which we began. Jung called the original wholeness the self, with a capital SS, distinguishing it from the ego, the little daylight personality that thinks of itself as the whole show. The self, he wrote, is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness. The first half of life is the journey away from the self into the ego. The second half, if we are fortunate and brave, is the journey back. This is the deep work the alchemists were performing. Every operation they described, every grotesque procedure with sulfur and mercury and salt, every blackening and whitening and reddening of matter, was a symbolic enactment of the journey home. They did not know this. That is the haunting part. They thought they were transforming lead into gold. They were, in fact, transforming themselves into something they could not yet name. Jung called this projection. The alchemist, staring into his vessel through long sleepless nights, was seeing not matter, but the contents of his own unconscious mirrored back at him. Everything unknown and empty, Jung wrote, is filled with psychological projection. It is as if the investigator's own psychic background were mirrored in the darkness. What the alchemist saw in the flask he attributed to the substance, but the substance was a screen. The drama was inside him. Now, where did alchemy come from? Its origins are disputed. It may have arisen in Egypt, in China, in India, in some forgotten quarter of the Middle East, or in all of these at once, with ideas migrating along the Silk Road like rumors of distant gods. But the most influential strand emerged from the marriage of two civilizations. The Greeks had given the world abstract thought, the philosophy of the four elements, the search for first principles. The Egyptians had given the world an obsession with matter, and its transformation they had mummified their dead in baths of sodium bicarbonate, what they called God substance, to make the body itself eternal. There was no division in the Egyptian mind between flesh and spirit. If you wanted eternal life, you needed a body that would last forever. When these two traditions met, in the cosmopolitan ferment of Hellenistic Alexandria, their child was alchemy, a Greek mind in an Egyptian body, philosophy made physical, matter made sacred. At the center of this tradition stands a figure who never existed, and who is therefore more real than most people who did. His name is Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, a composite deity stitched together from the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes, the messenger, the trickster, the guide of souls across the threshold of death. Hermeticism, the philosophy attributed to him, is condensed in a short text called the Emerald Tablet, which claims to contain the entire wisdom of alchemy in a few cryptic lines. The most famous of these is also the simplest: as above, so below. The inner world and the outer world are not separate. The microcosm reflects the macrocosm. What you do to yourself, you do to the universe. What you discover in the universe, you discover in yourself. The drop returns to the ocean, and the spark returns to the flame. This is the master key. Everything else in alchemy is a footnote to it. If we accept it, even provisionally, the alchemical work begins to make sense. The lead the alchemist holds in his hand is not just lead. It is the leaden quality of his own life, the dull, heavy, poisonous parts of himself he has not yet transformed. The gold he hopes to make is not just gold. It is the inner gold of self-realization, the luminous wholeness of a person who has done the work of becoming whole. The vessel in which the transformation takes place is the alchemist himself. The fire is his suffering. The substances are the contents of his psyche. And the operations, all those Latin terms that have come down to us through centuries of mystified manuscripts, are the procedures by which a divided self becomes one. There are 7 primary metals in classical alchemy, each linked to a planet. Gold is the sun, silver is the moon, copper is Venus, iron is Mars, tin is Jupiter, Mercury is Mercury, fittingly, and lead is Saturn, the heavy planet, the planet of melancholy, of time, of death. The Hindus mapped these same 7 metals onto the 7 chakras of the body. The Chinese alchemists worked with the elixir of life rather than the philosopher's stone, and many of their emperors, seeking immortality, drank potions that killed them. There are no shortcuts, the alchemists insisted, to becoming who you are. The work is the work. The fire must be lit, and you must be the one to feed it. The raw material with which the alchemist begins is called the prima materia, the first matter. It is the lowest, basest, most unpromising substance, imaginable rotten flesh, urine, feces, the dregs of existence. The alchemical proverb is in sterquilinis invenita, in filth it shall be found. The most precious thing you can become is hidden in the part of yourself you most want to throw away. You will not find your gold in your strengths. You will find it in your shadow, in your shame, in the parts of your life you have refused to look at. This is, psychologically, the great alchemical insight. We do not transform by polishing what is already shining. We transform by descending into what stinks. From this prima materia, the alchemists distinguished 3 principles, what they called the tria prima. Sulfur is the soul, the burning principle, what we love and desire and rage toward. Mercury is the spirit, the bridge, the mediator, the messenger between flesh and soul. Salt is the body, the fixed, the crystallist. Everything that exists in the world, the alchemists believed, is made of these 3 in some combination. To transform a substance, you separate it into its components and reunite them differently. Solve et coagula. Dissolve and coagulate. Break it down and put it back together. The phrase is a kind of mantra. It is also a precise description of what depth psychology does to a person. It dissolves the false self you have constructed, and from the broken pieces it coagulates a truer one. You cannot have the second without the first. There is no integration without disintegration. The caterpillar in the cocoon does not slowly grow wings. It liquefies entirely into an unrecognizable soup, and only then does the butterfly emerge. This is why the alchemical work is so often terrifying. It begins by destroying the person you thought you were. The first of the great operations is called calcinatio, the burning. Fire is the active, instinctual, devouring principle. To be calcinated is to be reduced to ash, all the lies, the pretenses, the comfortable identities incinerated until only what is true remains. Heraclitus, the dark philosopher of pre-Socratic Greece, taught that fire was the first principle from which everything else emerged. In the scriptures, God himself is described as a consuming fire. The seraphim, the highest order of angels, are literally the burning ones. What the fire takes from you, you did not need. What survives the fire is who you are. This is small comfort while you are in it. The fire does not know that you are tired. The fire does not care that you would prefer a gentler method. After the burning comes the dissolving. The second operation is solutio water, the dissolution of the solid into the liquid. Some texts call solutio the root of alchemy, the fundamental operation. When the burned ego is plunged into water, it loses its remaining structure. It softens. It immerses itself in the unconscious, the great ocean from which all psychic life arises. This is the dark night, not of fire, but of drowning, of being unmade. The third operation is coagulatio, The return liquid back to solid, spirit back to flesh, vapor back to earth. Something must be made fixed, embodied, real, otherwise you remain dissolved forever, a philosopher of the unlived life, full of insight and incapable of action. The word humility comes from the Latin humus, which means earth. To be humble is to be down to earth, to be grounded, to have done the slow work of incarnating your insights into actual behavior. Jung, in his old age, lived in a stone tower at Bollingen without electricity or running water. He chopped his own wood, he hauled his own water. These simple acts, he wrote, make man simple, and how difficult it is to be simple. The high abstractions are useless until they become this morning's actions. The fourth operation is sublimatio, the rising into air. Matter is volatilized, lifted, made spiritual. We gain the perspective from above, the cool view of the mountaintop, what Jung called psychic objectivity. From sufficient height, our problems often cease to be problems at all. They reveal themselves as small features of a larger landscape. But there is a danger here, the danger of becoming stuck in the air, of climbing the ladder of abstraction so high that someone takes the ladder away beneath you. A young man dreamed of climbing a ladder to a high platform, and of someone removing the ladder so that he could not get down. We need the ascent, but we also need the descent. We need the mountaintop and the marketplace. Man is a rope, Nietzsche wrote, tied between beast and overman, a rope over an abyss, a dangerous going across, a dangerous on the way, a dangerous looking back, a dangerous shuddering and staying still. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not an end. So far we have moved through the four classical elements: fire, water, earth, air. The remaining operations cross into stranger territory. As the alchemist worked, he noticed that the substances in his vessel passed through distinct stages of color. First the matter turned black, the Nigredo. Then it whitened, the Albedo, sometimes yellow, the citrinitas, though this fell out of favor. And finally it became red, the Rubedo. These were not merely chemical observations, they were also the colors of an inner journey, and each had its psychological meaning. The Nigredo is the blackening, the spiritual death. It is the place without light, the dark night of the soul, the moment when everything you believed about yourself collapses and you do not yet know what will replace it. The symbol of this stage is the raven, the bird of carrion and omen. Alchemists called it a black blacker than black. It includes depression, despair, grief, the loss of meaning, the temptation to numb oneself with anything that will dull the edge. This is the part of the journey most people would prefer to skip. There is no skipping it. The alchemical operation that corresponds to this stage is mortificatio, the killing, the rotting, the putrefactio, in which old forms break down into the compost from which new forms can grow. We see this everywhere in nature. The leaf falls, the fruit rots, the body returns to the soil from which it came. Decay is not the opposite of life. Decay is the precondition for the next round of life. The alchemists understood this. We have largely forgotten it. Jung saw the Nigredo as the necessary confrontation with the shadow, the parts of ourselves we have disowned, repressed, projected onto others. Self-knowledge, he wrote, is an adventure that carries us unexpectedly far and deep. Even a moderately comprehensive knowledge of the shadow can cause a good deal of confusion and mental darkness, since it gives rise to personality problems which one had never remotely imagined before. For this reason alone we can understand why the alchemists called their Nigredo melancholia, a black blacker than black. And yet, at the very bottom of the descent, something turns. The light begins to come not from above, but from beneath. The wound becomes the source of healing. This is the archetype of the wounded healer, the figure who is at home in the darkness and has learnt there to find germs of light. There is no light without shadow, Jung wrote, and no psychic wholeness without imperfection. To round itself out, life calls not for perfection, but for completeness. The transition between blackening and whitening is sometimes marked by an explosion of colour, the cauda pavonis, the peacock's tail, all the hues flashing at once. Then comes the albedo, the whitening, the washing away of impurities, the dove descending. The symbol is silver, the moon, the feminine principle, the cool clarity that follows the long night. This corresponds to the sixth operation, separatio, the awareness of the opposites. You can now see what is black and what is white, what is shadow and what is light, what is yours to integrate and what is yours to release. Many alchemists treated the albedo as the goal. To reach it was to have done the work, and it is a great achievement. But it is not the end. The end is the rubedo, the reddening, the appearance of the sun. The red is the colour of blood, of fire mastered, of life fully embodied. Here the philosopher's stone is finally produced. Here the king and the queen, the red and the white, the masculine and the feminine, may at last celebrate the hieros, the sacred marriage, the conjunctio. This is the seventh and final operation, and it was the one that most preoccupied Jung in his old age. The conjunctio is the reunion of what was separated, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, body and soul, ego and self. The hermaphroditic figure of Mercurius, who appeared at the beginning of the work as the chaos of the prima materia, reappears at the end as the new unity, the lumen novum, the new light. Mercurius stands at the beginning and end of the work, Jung wrote. He is metallic yet liquid, matter yet spirit, cold yet fiery, poison and yet healing draw to symbol, uniting all the opposites. What does this all amount to? What is the inner gold? It is not happiness exactly. The alchemists were under no illusions about happiness. It is something tougher and more enduring, a wholeness that does not depend on circumstance, a centre that holds when everything around it changes. The medieval image is of a wheel. On the rim of the wheel sits a king, and the wheel turns, and his words are, "I am reigning, I have reigned, I have lost my kingdom, I shall reign." Round and round he goes, riding fortune up and down. But at the centre of the wheel sits the figure of Christ or the self, in Jung's language, and that figure does not move. To be at the centre is not to be untouched by life. It is to be no longer at the mercy of it. The Greek philosophers called this state apatheia, not apathy, but freedom from being thrown about by one's own emotions, the wisdom of going along with whatever life puts in front of you because you no longer need it to be other than it is. It is not a permanent achievement. Even the wise old man and the wise old woman lose it and find it again. But the work is to spend more of one's life closer to the centre and less of it pinned to the spinning rim. To do this work requires, above all, the willingness to be alone with oneself. Most people will do almost anything to avoid this. If you are lonely when you are alone, Jung observed, you are in bad company. The alchemists understood that the great transformation happens in solitude, in the long sleepless nights with the vessel, in the slow watching of one's own substance turn from black to white to red. You cannot outsource it. You cannot hire someone to do it for you. You can read every book ever written about the unconscious, and it will not change you by a single degree. The work begins the moment you put the book down and sit with what is actually in you. And what is in you, at first, will not be pleasant. The mind that has not yet been turned upon itself is a noisy place. The voices are loud and certain. They tell you who you are and who you must be. To watch them, without believing them, is the beginning of freedom. This is what the alchemists meant by the long heat of the vessel. Nothing escapes, nothing is added. The fire is patient. Eventually, the substance changes. Jung worked on alchemy for 30 years. He never finished. The last great book of his life, Mysterium Conjunctionis, is an attempt to map the full territory of the conjunctio, and it leaves more questions than it answers. He did not pretend to have completed the work. He claimed only to have found a tradition that had taken it seriously in a culture that had largely forgotten how. The inner gold is real. It is buried, the alchemists insisted, in the basest matter of your own life. It cannot be bought. It cannot be inherited. It can only be made painstakingly by the slow application of fire and water and time, through stages whose names we have mostly lost. The work is hard. The work is necessary. And, as an old alchemist once consoled his disciple, no matter how isolated you are and how lonely you feel, if you do your work truly and conscientiously, unknown friends will come and seek you.